If it really wanted to, Apple could kill Windows pretty much overnight. With one decision, they could put an end to Microsoft's 3 decades dominance of enterprise computing, and they don't need to build anything new. Here's my thought experiment on how Apple could kill Windows. And before anyone comments, yes, I'm an unapologetic Apple fanboy, and no, I don't own any Apple shares, I never have. This is just a thought experiment, and there are many enormous technical details that would need to be solved. But hear me out and let me paint you a picture of how enterprise computing could once again be on the cusp of a huge shakeup once again. In 1984, Steve Jobs wanted to take on Big Brother. Back then, Big Brother was unmistakably IBM. IBM dominated business computing, and the PC market was effectively defined by IBM and IBM-compatible machines. So Apple cast itself as the rebel, freeing humanity from IBM's grip. For 40 years, Apple has gone its own way, built on a simple idea that if the device is yours, the data is yours, you get to decide what happens to it. But in 2026, IBM is no longer Big Brother. It's no longer either Big Blue, it's the blue dwarf of enterprise computing that's still burning, but on the slow, inevitable path to decline. Big Brother today is Microsoft. Windows, Office, Outlook, Teams, Entra ID, Azure, Copilot, GitHub, Visual Studio, LinkedIn, Xbox, and a 49% stake in OpenAI. There's never been a single company in history with so much power under one roof. And with this power, Microsoft has spent years disrespecting its users and pissing off its enterprise customers. They forced Windows 11 upgrades that obsoleted perfectly good hardware. They shoved Copilot into every corner of the operating system, whether you wanted it or not. They added telemetry you can't turn off. They created tricky licensing terms that get more complex every renewal cycle. And then they gaslit the entire world, painting doom and gloom, fear and uncertainty. Microsoft sold a dystopian future to governments and to ordinary people, telling them to come in line or get left behind. So how do we break this dominance and put the power back in the hands of users, just as Steve Jobs imagined? The answer is by killing Windows. Conventional wisdom says that Microsoft is untouchable in the enterprise space because of Active Directory, Office, and Excel. They've had the market stitched up since 1997, and since then, Apple has even stopped trying to compete. But Microsoft's moat isn't really Windows. Its moat is enterprise distribution and trust. But IT departments don't love Windows. They tolerate it because it's the devil they know, and because every enterprise vendor on Earth supports Windows. The sad fact is that most employees never know that there's an alternative to Windows and Office, or Microsoft in general. They just assume that's how computers work. But Europe, which has always been hostile to Microsoft's anti-competitive practices, is starting to prove otherwise. France has issued a directive requiring every ministry to develop a Linux migration. Microsoft has absolutely destroyed trust with Windows Copilot. The privacy overreaches are disgusting, and their contempt for users has been shameful. Microsoft is not the world's most trusted distributor for software. That honor goes to Apple. It's not a company trying to push software down your throat. It's a company trying to protect its brand and reputations by putting appropriate safeguards and controls in place. So now here's the thought experiment. Apple announces the Apple App Store will now distribute Linux applications, specifically ARM native Linux applications. But the catch is they need to be signed by Apple, vetted by Apple, monetized through Apple's payment infrastructure, and delivered through Apple's content delivery network. In simple terms, Apple could start distributing non-Apple applications into specific Linux distributions. Now, Apple doesn't actually use Linux. Mac OS shares a common ancestor, but it is significantly different to standard Linux, and it's not a simple thing that you can do. So by opening up the App Store to Linux, Apple does something more powerful than anybody else by providing the layer of trust. So the proposition is, if you want to reach enterprise, you buy your Linux applications through the Apple App Store. The developer would write their application once for ARM Linux, specific distribution, and Apple would handle the signing, distribution, updates, telemetry, payments, refunds, fraud, and security review. That's the same machinery that makes the iPhone App Store the most lucrative software channel in history. So how does this kill Windows? Well, today, a CIO buying enterprise software is buying three things bundled together. They buy the application, they buy the operating system it runs on, and they buy the trust framework that says it won't destroy the business. And of course, Microsoft sells all three. But in this scenario, Apple would unbundle that. The application would come from the developer. The trust comes from Apple, and the operating system, and this is the key here, becomes commodity infrastructure. But Apple doesn't need to certify, and nor should they certify every Linux distribution, because there are many flavors and variations. So for enterprise, Apple would need to certify specific distributions that meet Apple standards. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's a hardened Red Hat variant, which would probably make the most sense, or something that looks like Amazon Linux, but with Apple's security model bolted on. Maybe Apple partners with IBM and the Red Hat ecosystem to build a de facto enterprise standard, the one that Apple would bless. And all of a sudden, the enterprise operating system decision becomes trivial. You run the Linux that runs the apps come from Apple, and the trust comes from Apple. Windows becomes a legacy tier back when trust was cheap. But in this new world, trust has become a whole lot more valuable. Apple has spent 15 years building the security model around code signing, sandboxing, and entitlements. iOS is arguably the most successful applied security architecture in computing history. Android is okay, but nowhere near as tight. Windows isn't close, and desktop Linux definitely isn't close. But if Apple extends its trust model into enterprise Linux distribution, Apple effectively becomes the trust layer for an operating system that Apple doesn't own and doesn't have to maintain. The developer will get a single ARM target, global distribution, and Apple's payment system. The enterprise gets vetted software, predictable security, and a vendor that isn't trying to upsell them Copilot every 5 minutes. The obvious objection is that Apple doesn't want to be in the enterprise. Apple is a consumer hardware company. But I'd argue the opposite, because Apple's silicon in the data center is already happening. There are Mac studios running production workloads at companies you've never heard of, and the M-series chips are objectively the most efficient compute per watt silicon that's available today. Apple is just one strategic decision away from being the most important enterprise vendor in the world. They just have to want it. So that's the thought experiment. Apple doesn't kill Windows by building better Windows. Apple kills Windows by making the operating system irrelevant, by becoming the trust layer that sits above it. I'm not saying it would be easy, but I am saying it would be worthwhile. And while it's great to see so many people personally move off Windows onto Linux, the real problem is making enterprise trusted binaries. Here's a video from 2014 with Linus explaining the problem in his own style.
We make binaries for Windows and OS X. We basically don't make binaries for Linux. Why? Because making binaries for Linux desktop applications is a major pain in the ass.
Apple could fix this problem and put an end to one of the most aggressive and voracious software companies in the world. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Errol Brandt, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how Apple distributing Linux applications could change the entire enterprise landscape. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.